All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on what is a very wet and windy evening here in Bar Harbor. I hope you can hear me over my sump pump, which has been going all day down cellar, as I imagine yours has. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kate. I'm a reporter at the Maine Monitor. And a few months ago, this past fall, we published a series of 10 stories looking at communities in Maine and how they are dealing with sea level rise. And as part of that whole package, we also did a panel discussion at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute back, I think it was in October now, November. It was a wonderful panel, and we have decided to kind of follow it up with this one here tonight. I am joined, we're very grateful to our guests this evening. I'm joined tonight by Allison McKellar. She's a select board member in Camden, and she's been documenting sea level rise in her community. We also have with us David Plavin, who is a resident of Camp Ellis and vice president of Save Our Shores Saco Bay, which is an advocacy organization working to bring attention to severe coastal erosion caused by the erection of the Saco River jetty at Camp Ellis. And we have Peter Slavinsky, who's a marine geologist with the Maine Geological Survey, and he has been talking to communities around the state about adapting to sea level rise for years. So thank you to all of us for taking the time to join us tonight. And part of the reason we wanted to have this discussion now is because it has been about a month and 2 days since that big December storm that we saw just before Christmas. And that knocked out power to 365,000 households and businesses around the state and brought wind gusts of 65 miles an hour and a lot of coastal flooding because of that storm surge that was combined with the astronomical high tide. So I'm sure you all saw the very dramatic pictures. You know, we had one person being rescued from a car in floodwaters in Wells. We had some, very intense floodwaters in Camden and in Camp Ellis, and we actually have some footage, I believe, that Allison and David have shared with us tonight that we're going to see in a little while. So this is a short discussion, so I'm just going to jump right in. And while we talk, if you think of any questions that you have for the panelists, if you could just type them into the chat box, and our executive director, Michaela, will be keeping track of those, and she's going to bring them to me, and we will bring them all in at the end. So I am going to start with David and Allison, since you both live in communities that saw a fair amount of flooding and damage from the storm.
Let me deal with that. I was asking if it was near.
There we go. Allison, if you could just start, can you describe what the storm was like for you and the damage that you witnessed?
Sure. It was actually fairly similar to many of the other storms that we've had. I think a lot of people imagine this was just a storm that was completely isolated from all the others, and it's sort of a once in 50 years or once in 100-year kind of situation. But really, it was just like a few inches higher than many others that we've seen. But every time that the water gets a little bit higher or there's a little bit more wind, it's like a whole new area of the town gets covered. And it's interesting because a lot of the time you think about like the flooding that we've seen on the news throughout our lives. At least for me, it's like Louisiana, Florida, where a lot of the damage is done by just things being wet for a long time. In Camden, that's not so much what's causing the damage. It's the force of the water and how it pushes things around. And what this storm did for us that was different or just more exaggerated than the past ones is it, especially in the harbor, right in the marina where we have all of our boating infrastructure. Thank goodness it didn't happen in the summer when there was more of it out, but all of our ramps and wharves, all of that is designed so that it takes you from the parking lot and the public landing, for instance, and goes down. So the entire design for everything was like a little bit like an elbow, you think about it. And all of a sudden, when it gets to a certain level, it's pushing everything in the opposite direction. So it doesn't take much, just like if you try to bend one of your joints the wrong direction, it doesn't take much to have it do just a lot of damage. And I think this one, it's hard sometimes to tell exactly which storm did which amount of damage, but over the years, as we've had, you know, a lot of these slight overtopping events, it's weakened everything. And this time we saw quite a bit of damage. So I do have I don't know if this is the right time to show a video just to give you kind of a little sampling. I've developed like a few spots that I go out to that I know every time, okay, well, I'm going to go check these places. I assume that there are probably lots of places in Maine that had damage that was worse than Camden, but it doesn't always get, you know, documented right away. It's somebody, you know, notices it much later. So here we go.
Can you narrate a little bit for us? Can you just tell us what we're looking at for those of us who
Sure.
aren't
So,
super familiar with the Camden waterfront?
so it looks like it's kind of like a little bit choppy, but so that was before, that was 1 hour before high tide, and now we're looking at 1 hour after high tide. It's looking really choppy for me, but you can see here that even though it's not that much above the wharf, it's pushing all of that boardwalk up, and then the gravel, the crushed stone, is getting pushed below. This is here, maybe just pause it for 1 second so that it can catch up with itself. Is this the version on YouTube? Are you playing it from you? Yeah, looks like it's like a little bit choppy.
Yeah.
So this is one of the condominiums in town, and it was built on top of a marina, and one of the great. And so this floods all the time, but it was much worse this time, and actually starting to splash up onto Bayview Street, not just in the parking lot. So this, I mean, literally used to be ocean, and it's being reclaimed now. All right, go for it.
It also looks like there's quite a, I don't know if this is from that, but there's quite a bit of damage to that foundation as well, or the.
Oh yeah.
Right there.
So there's the yacht club, looking at the yacht club from across the harbor. And, you know, we get a little bit of splashover sometimes. Oh.
Turn that one off, Chaz. Yes, leave.
Yeah, so it makes just all the difference in the world. I mean, we have, you know, 12.3 foot high tides all, you know, fairly frequently. But when the wind comes from the east or the southeast, it changes everything for Camden. This was the first time we had a pier, just completely, went with this house here. That collapsed, it fell apart, it got broken apart. There were, instead of just seaweed in the parking lot like we normally have when it floods, there were nails and boards, and the benches here in Harbor Park, instead of just flooding, they got knocked off of their bases and were floating around. It was the first time I felt like it wouldn't be safe for me to go and try to, you know, stop something from getting washed away. This is an area that, you know, very rarely gets wet behind those benches.
Very dramatic.
And so again, what we see a lot in Camden Harbor, the harbor used to be much bigger. That all would have been beach back in the late 1700s, but it's these areas that were filled in at one point or another. Not only are we dealing with, you know, sea level rise kind of going over that tipping point, but it's also in some cases like sucking the material back out. So the land is sinking a little bit. This is Lake Beach. We thought that this was going to be okay. These stairs just got redone. I thought that they had been okay because they were okay during this video. But I guess they did get washed out. So there's the pier. And there it is after the storm. And these are all the pieces of it. And one thing we haven't really dealt with or, you know how to answer necessarily is, you know, who's responsible when somebody's structure smashes apart and ends up on somebody else's lawn. So that is a big, you know, question that isn't really explicitly addressed in our ordinances. You can find different things to pull from, but a lot of people are asking, okay, is the pier owner responsible for damage to the yacht club because their pier fell apart? And what about rebuilding? Right now we have a moratorium in Camden on new piers, but otherwise, they probably would have been able to just put that pier right back up just the way it was. So lots of things to deal with.
Lots of things to think about. And we should say Allison goes out on most storms and also just regular high tides and documents what's going on in Camden. So she has a treasure trove of photos. I don't know, was there anything else you wanted to share at the moment, or?
Oh, I circle back around. I could go
Okay.
on and on, but
Okay.
save that for later.
Well, David, so David, as I mentioned, you are a resident of Camp Ellis, and your house is about as close to the ocean as one could possibly be. You have beautiful views. So I've seen photos. So David, you evacuated your house, as I understand it. Can you tell us why you decided to leave and, what it looked like when you returned?
So I go by wave height and use marine forecasts as my guide. And when waves are, above 15 feet, that's usually a clue that I'm probably better off somewhere else. It's not that I can't stay there. I probably could, but it's difficult to be sitting in a house and, having it shaking all over the place and waves smacking up against it. So that's usually my guideline. And, you knew this one was going to be bad. Plus it was a astronomical high tide at the same time. So all things considered, I left for the day on the storm. I was not there. Came back the next morning. There's some pictures in there if you want to, under 2022 storm. If you look at the one, storm surge is a picture of the storm surge. My neighbor took some pictures for me, and I was able to get them. So I didn't. Plus, I've sort of lost my appetite for taking pictures during storms. I mean, you've seen it, and you don't really need to document it all that much. But if you look at the one storm surge, you can see that's one of the streets in Camp Ellis that got damaged. That's my house, and you can see, if you look closely enough, you can see the water on the roof going in over the front door, and pretty much engulfing the entire. I don't have a lot of property there, but engulfing the entire property. So the street gets flooded. The damage is basically siding. You lose siding. My patio gets all torn up, and it was pretty bad. And I moved there in 2016, and in 2018, we had a pretty major storm. And one of my neighbors who'd been there a long time told me that it was a 1 in 10 year storm. And well, that would have been nice, but it was actually like a 1 in 4, because 4 years later we had this one, which was more powerful and definitely more powerful. You can look at any of those. Yeah, that's another one. So the water comes. We frequently get water on the street, and there's a couple of storm drains on each side which get totally overflowed. And the good thing is it has never gotten into my house, so most of the homes do not take in water, but it's still, it's still not a great thing. So this picture here is North Avenue in Camp Ellis, which that is normally a paved road, what you're looking at there. And there's Jersey barriers that they use to line the, to try to keep the beach from getting into the road. This road gets washed out frequently, but big storms, it rips up all the pavement. It'll now be closed until the spring. And you can see all the Jersey barriers they are normally on the right side of that picture, and they're all got pushed over to the left side, and it was it's pretty messy. You can pick out another one if you'd like. That's my house. That's a sampling of damage. This was not, yeah, and you know, most of it's been cleaned up. I'm happy to say. If you look at, yeah, so all those rocks that you see there, they were actually in the street where that truck is, and they were plowed, but a lot of them were plowed, but all the force of the water just kicks up so much debris, and that's normally just a soil bed of sea roses, and it got just totally annihilated by all that sand and rock and debris that kicks over the seawall, which you can see on the left side there. We have it's basically a dirt road, a seawall in the ocean, and that's how close I am. And most of the houses in Camp Ellis are that close. And also, if you go down toward Ferry Beach and Saco, a lot of them are also very close.
David, do you have a basement? I do.
I have a full basement, but it no water good. And that picture right there just shows the force of the waves was so strong that I had wall cracks on the inside of my house this time, which I did not have before. And that's another house, and that wooden restraining wall just got totally destroyed. And where the phone pole is usually a dirt road, but you can see that that's also been washed out, and it's part of this isn't damage that is exclusive to this storm. Most storms do have an effect on all the things you're seeing, but it's just magnified by like 5 or 10 from this storm. That's a road that's very close to the water. Actually, the left, that's the right side. If you looked at the left side, there's a seawall, and then the ocean. It came over and cracked all the tar. So here's the other thing that I thought I'd mention. The Saco Public Works does an amazing job coming down here after these storms and trying to make us whole again. This is a worksheet that I got from the director of DPW, and they've submitted $180,000 in infrastructure damages that occurred as a result of this storm. As of today, we're not sure if we're going to get any FEMA assistance or not. The York County threshold, as you can see at the bottom, is $932,000, and so I don't know what the other towns have put in for it, but it needs to reach a certain level, and then a disaster can be declared, and then we can get FEMA money. We got FEMA money in 2018, and maybe I'll talk more about that later, but no FEMA money as of today. It does take a while, and I think we still have a chance to get some.
David, did you personally get FEMA money in 2018, or the town?
I have flood insurance. I made a claim in 2018, got some money. I've made a claim for this storm as well, but I haven't heard yet. And they really, I'd have been better off getting money if I had a foot of water in my basement. But since I didn't, it's a lot more difficult to convince them that, that storm damage warrants some sort of reparation.
Did it cover did the money that you got from FEMA cover the damages in that last storm? No. They really will only cover structural damage or damage to the structure itself. And a lot of the damage I get is like patio damage or stone damage. And and if you go into that, there's some pictures of 2016. I have a folder, 2018 pictures. Michaela, if you look in there, there's some pictures of what I sustained in 2018. Let's see. Mika, do you have those?
Yeah, she should.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
working on it. I'm sorry about that.
No.
It's being a little stubborn. There we go.
So if you click on 2018 home damage, you'll see that that's the type of damage that in 2018. No, my 2018 home damage. Keep going. It's the third one in that list. Anyway, I since that storm, I've made some. I've tightened up the defenses a little bit, and even though this storm was worse than 2018, the damage I sustained was a lot less.
Well, we could have a whole long conversation, a whole separate discussion about FEMA and FEMA funds, but I think that would take a lot longer than we have tonight.
Yeah. So that right there was what was my restraining wall, my patio, and then the seawall to the right. And the seawall got pretty dinged up this time too. So there's nothing stronger than water.
Yeah. That might be the tagline for the night. All right. Well, Peter, I'd love to turn to you. So we are very accustomed to nor'easters in Maine, but the winds for that storm on the 23rd were actually out of the south. And I have talked to you in the past, and you mentioned that anecdotally we're seeing a lot more southeasters and winds out of the south as the climate changes. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how changing wind patterns can intensify damage from storms.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for the question, Kate, and Allison and David, thanks for sharing those experiences. Before I answer the question, I want to give a little bit of context. This storm, so we have water level records that go back to Portland to 1912. This storm was the 4th highest water level recorded since 1912. So that's pretty significant. But so Allison described, this is going to get into my answering the question, but Allison described a little bit more flooding than normal in Camden. And think about it geographically. So if Camden's right up here, when you have a nor'easter, the wind is blowing water out of Camden Harbor. When you have a southeaster, the wind is blowing water directly into Camden Harbor. And that actually probably also explains why David didn't see quite as much damage as he did in the 2018 event, which was more of a nor'easter. So if we go back in time, we've had lots of southeasters. I mean, our 1% storm event, or our 100-year storm in southern Maine, is actually a nor'easter in February of 1978. But if you go up to the mid-coast, their 1% storm is a southeaster from January of 1978. So we've had them. But yes, Kate, anecdotally, I mean, I've actually put out some feelers to the National Weather Service and to the state climatologists, also posing this question to them of, are we actually seeing more southeasters than we have historically? And I haven't gotten good scientific data back yet on that. But basically, think about it like this. Our coastline and even our inland areas are basically conditioned for responding to a nor'easter. The areas that erode have already kind of eroded to a certain point. The areas that flood, we already know they flood, and infrastructure that's in those areas has already kind of been designed to be slightly more resilient. We statistically see a lot more nor'easters than we do southeasters. Our trees, for instance, are also conditioned for northeast winds. You know, CMP goes and cuts things down, or the wind actually just knocks down trees. And because we've had more nor'easters, our trees are conditioned for them. With southeasters, it does seem like we're seeing more events occurring in late fall and early winter. I've lived in Maine only for 22 years. I can't recall so many southeasters as we've had in the last 5 years. A couple of the storms in the 2018 were southeasters. So kind of think about it from like a conditioning standpoint, that our coastline and even our infrastructure has been conditioned for nor'easters. But we have a lot of areas that in southeasters, the known areas are going to flood, the known areas are going to erode, but the areas that aren't conditioned or are exposed to those southeast winds are going to have much more damage than they would in this northeaster when the wind is blowing offshore. Michaela, if you could cue up a photo from Ocean Park. either of the photos from my folder for Ocean Park. Ocean Park is a community in Old Orchard Beach, just north of where David lives, on the other side of Goose Fair Brook. And in nor'easters, yeah, this area floods, but it doesn't flood like this typically. When the wind is blowing out of the northeast, it's basically blowing from, I guess, just on the other side of that gray house towards the coastline. When it's blowing from the southeast, it's blowing into the mouth of Goose Fair Brook, and then water backs up over. They have a tide gate in this community. They literally have a tide gate that stops tidal flow into this community. But it doesn't matter if you have a tide gate once the water goes up and over the tide gate and starts flooding the streets. So again, basically in response to your question, we have our coastlines conditioned for this. An area of our coastline that gets hit really, really, really hard in southeasters, a lot more than nor'easters, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more in other conversations, is our bluffed coastline. 48% of Maine's coastline is made up of erodible coastal bluffs. They're usually made up of clay or sand. And if you think about it, the ones that face northeast would have already been eroded to a certain point, while the ones that face southeast historically haven't seen as many storms, and therefore so much erosion. So a lot of the southeasters hit our coastal bluff shoreline very, very hard and result in basically unprecedented erosion that does not happen in nor'easters because the wind is blowing offshore. So whether or not we're seeing more, I'll let you know when I hear back from the climatology folks, but it does seem like that is occurring. And we are seeing, somebody posted a little in the chat that 6 of the 30th highest water levels, I think, have occurred in I didn't see what the chat thing said, but in my pictures, if you don't mind opening real quick, I have a graph of, it's a chart of water levels for the tide gauges. And then I'll shut up and we can move on to another question.
No. Well, while she's opening that, actually,
Sorry, Peter, is it the tide levels? Is that the one I'm looking for?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
while she's opening that, can you briefly just, so the word bluff, I know you said briefly it's clay or sand, but the word bluff in my mind conjures up a lot of things. Can you just say
Nope.
exactly what a bluff is in Maine?
Sure.
Like, what are we talking about? Really tall cliffs, or what does this look like?
Yeah, and it's not that one, Michaela. It's the other one that says down at the 2022 water level rankings, third from the top. Kate, a bluff is basically 3 feet or more, not always vertical, but relatively steep, of erodible material.
Okay.
Basically, that's a general definition of it. It can be classified as stable, unstable, or highly unstable based on the conditions on it, the material that's on it, the amount of vegetation, the type of vegetation. But if you're looking at, if you're walking along a beach and you see a cut in that, that's not a bluff. It's usually made up of clay or a sandy clay material. So
Yeah.
before I end, these are statistics showing how the year 2022, from January all the way to December, ranked in relationship to all of those months, going back to in CV Island, which is in southern Maine, to 1930, in Wells 2005, Portland 1912, Bar Harbor 1947, Cutler 2011, and Eastport 1929. So basically, 2022, those blocks that are in red means that December was in the top 5 for instance, January, it says, was the 10th for Portland. That means January of 2022 was the 10th highest water level for all Januaries going back to 1912. While in Eastport, it was the 4th highest. So, and this is an average water level for the whole month. So basically, you can see lots of red blobs and yellow blobs in here, meaning it's either in the top 5 or the top 10. So yes, we are seeing high water consistently in this past year. Thanks. I just wanted to end with that one.
Yeah, no, that's great. That I hadn't seen that before. That's very interesting. All right, how are we doing on time, Mika? Are we
You're doing all right.
Okay, all right. Well, then we've got a couple more questions for everybody, and then we will turn to questions in the chat. And I just want to note, so thank you, James. Bennett noted that Governor Mills had requested 30 days additional time to get the disaster request into the executive branch. So the new deadline is the 23rd of February. So we will know in about a month what this will look like for Southern Maine for the disaster declaration. All right, let's see. David, I'd love to go back to you. As I mentioned, you are the Vice President of Save Our Shores Saco Bay. And for those of you who don't know, SOS Saco Bay is an organization that's been advocating to remediate an erosion problem caused by the construction of the Saco River Jetty at Camp Ellis. For those of you who aren't familiar with the jetty, it was built by the Army Corps of Engineers more than 150 years ago, and it substantially altered the pattern of currents and sand deposition in the area. And it eventually resulted in a shoreline that in 1998 was 400 feet from where the shoreline stood in 1908. So Congress recently authorized $45 million to fix the jetty. And David, can you just describe what this fix is and how it will help protect against storms like this in the future?
So the Army Corps proposal is to build a 750-foot jetty spur off the jetty. And I do have a picture of the jetty that might help, especially people that aren't familiar with it. There's a folder in there. Let's see. Called Solutions.
The picture called Jetties, David?
Yeah. So the jetty on the right is the north, that's the Saco, the mouth of the Saco River. There's South Jetty on the Biddeford side, and the North Jetty is on the Saco side. And the water waves deflect off that jetty and come into the shore at a 45-degree angle, and they've been pushing sand out of Camp Ellis further up the Saco Bay shoreline for God knows how many years, but for a long time. So there's no sand basically in Camp Ellis, and there's more sand northward. So the idea would be to build the Army Corps wants to build a 750-foot jetty perpendicular to shore, 1,500 feet out, and that would cover, that would help remediate. That would help remediate the waves somewhat, but a lot of us, myself included, are not really in love with that solution, even though that's what the Army Corps wants to do and what we want them. We had Living Shoreline Solutions come in and do a study, state-run study in November of 2021. And they have wave attenuation devices, which are concrete pyramids, and they do what we think would do a better job. And Peter can probably explain this better than I can, but
So, what I keep thinking? Why the fuck didn't we ask them to program those funds?
Wow.
Sorry, David, what were you saying?
think the solution that we would prefer would be to use the concrete wave attenuation devices and build a barrier that would run 3,000 feet from the jetty northward. And I think that would do a better job. I'm not sure anything would do it. I'm not sure how anything could, to fight a storm like the last one. I'm not a scientist, but I think we definitely need to have something out there because we lose sand regardless of storms. Camp Ellis is the most erosive beach in the state of Maine, and it's very, I have some other pictures too that illustrate it, but it's really bad. But that's what the Corps wants to do. We still don't have the Corps' proposal. We're working on getting that, and then the Corps and the city of Saco will act as partners and hopefully get something done in the next 2 or 3 years.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
You mind if I provide a little bit of context for the listeners?
Yeah, no, please do. I mean,
Awesome.
you've been here 100 times, you know the area, you know
Yeah,
the area pretty well.
So just real quick, I'm going to hit the annotation and I should be able to draw. So David described this northern jetty. You should be able to see, hopefully you see the pen, everyone. So this northern jetty is over 6,200 feet long. Okay, so that's just scale for you. Mount Washington is just a slight bit higher. I'm not sure what happened to the image, but yeah, there we go. So basically what happens is all the waves, doesn't matter what direction they're coming from. Even if they're from the southeast, they curve around through this big deep channel and they come in and they hit the jetty out here and they reflect off the jetty in this direction. Okay, and that causes lots of erosion here. So the idea the Corps came up with is 1,500 feet offshore, somewhere in this area here, is to, I think it's this area here, is to build a spur that goes out like this. So the idea is when the waves come in here, they hit this spur and it gets broken up. And then this would be done in conjunction with the beach nourishment project, which would fill sand back in this area here. So that's just the context I wanted to provide. Thanks.
Yeah, well, and that actually kind of dovetails nicely with the next question we had for you, Peter, which is, it's tempting after events like this for homeowners to want to go out and kind of fortify their properties and armor themselves. Maybe by building a seawall or planting trees, something to prevent erosion. So, but can you talk a little bit about when and where seawalls might be appropriate and what effects they have on the beach?
Sure. That's a tough one. I mean, I'll start out a little bit talking about regulations and then get into it a little bit. I'm not a regulator, but I'll put that hat on right now to pretend that I am one. So Maine has a lot of regulations in some areas, specifically the beach and dune system, that do not allow the construction of new seawalls. We saw what happens when seawalls go in. Basically, when seawalls go in, what happens is you get a storm and reflected wave energy. When David showed those wonderful pictures of the waves hitting the wall and bashing and going over. Well, if you think about it from the context of water particles, that same energy that's being deflected up is also being deflected down. And then what happens is it scours the sand out adjacent to the base of the wall. So in areas where you have walls, you have much deeper water. What that causes is because the water is deeper, you can get larger waves there. So it's a kind of a perpetual problem that hurts itself. The other problem with seawalls that's been recognized in the coastal sand dune rules of the Natural Resources Protection Act is they cause what's called end effect. It's very difficult in a very dynamic system like dunes and beaches to have a static structure. And when that structure, especially if it's along the shoreline, if it ends, think of a wave hitting that structure again, that wave energy goes up, it goes down, and it also at the sides of the structure, it tries to go around the structure. So you end up with what's called end effect erosion. What that does is because this is now eroding, the property owner here says, well, I need a wall. They put one in, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one. So it perpetuates itself. So that's why in the sand dune system, the state of Maine recognized the damage that walls cause and said no new seawalls. If you have an existing seawall, you can replace it very, very quickly with what's called a permit by rule, which is a very simple 14-day review process. If you want to build something different, it has to go through a much more complex permitting process. And you have to prove that the structure that's going in is going to be less damaging to the sand dune system than the one that's already there. So basically, they don't want walls to just get really, really big, but there have been cases where the walls have gotten slightly higher to protect from sea level rise and things that are occurring. And in the case that they've gotten higher, they've actually gone landward. So that's kind of the beach and dune system. You really can't build new walls. Along the rest of Maine coastline, especially the bluffed coast, we don't have a specific chapter in the Natural Resources Protection Act that protects bluffs. We probably should, but we don't. 48% of our coastline, and we don't have a chapter that protects bluffs. We have standards in the Natural Resources Protection Act that says if you have to put a wall above the high tide line if possible, because the whole traditional thinking there is, if this is an eroding bluff, all of the resources we want to protect are the wetlands, the mud flats, and things out here. So if you start your wall above the high tide line, you're not impacting those resources. It kind of makes sense when you think about it that way. But what's happening is with increased storms, with sea level rise, and with the context of the processes I talked about, when you have a structure and you have waves acting on it in both directions, the resources that we're trying to protect actually are getting pinched out because the sea level's rising. This wall is prohibiting them from actually moving landward, which is what they would be doing in response to sea level rise over time. And the coastal bluffs, which supply the sand to the resources we're trying to protect, the supply of sediment is cut off. So we have standards that say you can't have an unreasonable impact on the supply of sediment to the wetlands from the uplands. But what's really unreasonable? If you think about it in the context of a cove, and an eroding cove, it's got wetlands and mud flats in it. One house on that cove, it puts a wall in, that's not really unreasonable. 2 houses, 3 houses, 4 houses, 5 houses, 6 houses. Next thing you know, the whole cove is armored, and the supply of sediment to that resource that we're trying to protect is cut off completely. So that's probably an unreasonable impact. So that's one reason why the state has been spending a lot of time and effort looking at and trying to push what we call nature-based solutions or living shorelines. David mentioned that. And it's a way of putting infrastructure or mimicking or kind of a gray area in between those two. If you think about it, living shorelines can be everything from all you're doing is planting vegetation or bringing in sand. So say dune restoration, that's a living shoreline, to all the way on this spectrum, say putting in a riprap wall at the base and then regrading a bluff and then planting it with vegetation. And everything in between those two things would be considered a nature-based solution or a living shoreline. So that's something that is being looked at pretty closely. We don't have any regulations specific to living shorelines yet. There is a talk of creating a permit by rule for a living shoreline, is my understanding. You can do living shorelines with very simple things if you're in a dune system, like dune restoration. But I think need to ask themselves is, what's causing my erosion? For instance, if you're on a bluff, is it toe erosion of the bluff solely? In 50% or more of the cases, it's not just toe erosion, it's upland land management. We see a lot of bluffs where there's lawn cut to the edge of the bluff, and then people are complaining that the bluff's eroding. It's because bluffs need to have a thick, wide area of very, very hardy vegetation that soaks up moisture to survive well. If it's just lawn to the edge of the bluff, there's nothing holding that material. And then when we get these southeasters, which by the way, dump a lot more rain than the northeasters typically, saturates the soil, goes through the bluff, hits the clay layers, and saturates out the face of the bluff. So what you thought was just toe erosion, eroding the toe of the bluff, is actually now causing failure at the top because of oversaturation due to poor upland land management techniques. So it's really, really a combination of all these things we have to think of when we're thinking of armoring the shoreline. And there are certainly areas of the Maine coastline where armoring, it makes sense. A lot of the rocky areas, you know, you're basically mimicking nature by putting in more rock. But anytime we're talking about these softer features, there are a lot of permitting processes you're probably going to have to go through, and we have to consider the impacts to the natural resources as well. And last thought, and I'll end. We also have for coastal property owners a Maine Coastal Property Owners Guide to Erosion, Flooding, and Other Hazards, and it covers hazards in wetlands, beaches and dunes, and bluff areas, and talks about a lot of the things that I'm kind of very, very quickly generalizing with my hands as I'm talking here. So please do check that out. It's a good resource, and it's very helpful in kind of guiding how to think about this stuff.
Peter, could you repeat that one more time and I'll put it in the chat?
It's in that recommended resources list, but it's the Maine Coastal I'll put it in the chat after when somebody else, I have a link to it and everything, when the next question is going on.
think oops, I think I've got it here. Hang on. Let me,
Yeah, it's the Maine Coastal Property Owner's Guide to Erosion, Flooding, and Other Hazards. It's called. It's actually the second edition.
yeah. Oh, the second, I may have linked to the first. It's a very extensive document. It's really helpful. All right, let's see. I've got time. I'm gonna, I think we'll end here with Allison and then we will go to questions in the chat. Allison, so, you know, obviously we saw some really extensive damage in that video that you showed us to certain waterfront areas. I know it's a little early, it's only been a month, but I'm wondering what you can tell us about plans to rebuild, and, you know, if so, you know, what are those discussions like? Are you talking about, or are people talking about rebuilding to a different standard or putting in place certain ordinances? What is that looking like around town?
Yeah, so, you know, just to start off, I want to be clear that I'm one elected official in the town of Camden. We haven't had a chance as a board, as a select board, to talk about the storm sort of as a group and any decision-making that might come along with that. We are in the budget preparation phase right now for the town too, but yes, of course, there are lots of conversations all the time. There are lots of questions. There is a group of staff that are scrambling right now, trying to get estimates together for the possible disaster declaration. And it's hard because FEMA focuses so much on, you know, repairing things generally to the, you know, to the way that they were before the storm. And in so many cases, the way things were before the storm is part of the reason that they're the way they are now. So with, you know, with our form of decision-making in small town New England, a lot of what we do tends to be reactive because the form of democracy is so kind of prolonged and labor intensive. Everybody gets to vote on most things that, you know, elected officials don't get to do much all on our own. So you have to ask for money, you have to have a plan, everybody has to be, you know, on board. And then the way we normally do it is you make a plan, you get everybody to agree, and then you allocate funding, and then 2 years later you do it. When things fall apart the way that they have been, you have to act quickly sometimes. Some things can kind of just be patched up so that you can think about what you want to do in the long term. But there are certain things, you know, with a public landing, and I'm sure there's a group of people at the yacht club talking about, like, okay, we're going to have to, you know, scramble to get things at least safe for the summer. But what, you know, you don't want to use hundreds of thousands of dollars just putting things back the way they were. So that's definitely happening. The other big thing is that so much of what happens in the harbor is, you know, if one property owner does something, if the town does something to, say, raise the public landing, say we got all the funding and we got grants and we had a plan for raising the public landing, well, that has implications for the adjacent property owners. And the same goes for, you know, many other properties. So do you have to try to ideally get everybody talking about what the solution is going to be, but inevitably not everybody's interests are aligned and not everybody's ready to make a change at the same time. So it's really having some, you know, more direction from the state. I'm just soaking up, listening to Pete. It's like, I just want him to follow us around all the time and help us make decisions in Camden, because so much of the decision-making is left to non-experts. And we really need some help with the best way to move forward and the best way to spend sort of massive amounts of money that are being made available.
Well, I'm gonna let everybody be brave here. I don't know if anybody has some questions for us. You feel free to raise your hand, and I can call on you. I will try and keep track here. And if you don't have questions, I have more questions. So, you know, where are we here?
It looks
John?
like John has one.
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. I there must be an electronic way to raise my hand, but I couldn't find it. I'm just pleased to see Peter Slavinsky here because I know he's an expert on beaches and shorelines. And I found a great deal of what he talked about this evening fitting with my own experience and my own observations of the storms here in South Portland, which is where I am. I'm in South Portland, close to Willard Beach, the shipping channel, where the Portland Harbor opens up to the ocean. Southeasterly storms, we had a bad one in January of 2022, and then of course this terrible one we just had in December. Southeasterly storms come just hurtling through the shipping channel, and they hit all through Willard Beach, but they hit with great impact at the north end of Willard Beach and the bluffs that underlie what we call the shoreway, the Spring Point Shoreway, which is a favorite place to walk and exercise in South Portland. So the southeasterly storms come in the channel. They blow past Willard Beach. They flooded Willard Beach in December, and they smash into the bluffs at the Spring Point Shoreway. And everything that's near there. So Fort Preble is an old fort that I believe was built around 1812. Large multiple ton granite blocks were knocked over by this storm in December. The southern wall of Fort Preble used to have 4 gun ports. Now it has 3. One of them got knocked over. And just as long as Peter is here, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Peter, but again, just so much of what you say resonates with my experience that I just, can't let an opportunity go by to ask you a question. If you wanted to slow down that southeasterly storm surge so it didn't smash things up as it comes into South Portland. And again, I resonated to what you said. The land is not adapted to southeasterly storms. It's adapted to nor'easters, and these sou'easters are doing damage that the land is not prepared for. So I just wonder, and I don't want to put you on the spot, and I'm not put you, but if you wanted to slow down that storm surge coming in the shipping channel in South Portland, what do you think we could do?
Well, I mean, there are a couple different options that could be explored. One is, what do you do to the bluffs that are eroding? That you could, in other words, you could try to do something at those bluffs. It's not a sand dune system where those bluffs are, so you wouldn't be constrained by the sand dune rules. There may be a clause in there because it's adjacent to a sand dune system that there would be concern about, what's done to stabilize the bluffs may have an adverse impact on the neighboring beach. So there probably might be some kind of studies or something like that that might be required. That's one approach, probably a more realistic approach. Another approach possibly could be, and this is me not knowing the water depths out there, but another approach could be an offshore breakwater, for instance. Mm-hmm. I don't know where it would go. I don't know how deep the water is there. I don't know how high it would need to be. I don't know how deep, how far underwater it would have to extend. There are things called floating breakwaters mm-hmm. There's one at the marina near the B&M bean plant that's pretty good at breaking up nor'easters. So I don't see why a floating breakwater couldn't work there. I don't know what you'd need for a permit for that. If they're considered permanent structures, anything like that from a regulatory standpoint. So that might be a little harder to permit. But really, those are kind of the 2 options that I think of when I think of that area. You could try, there also could be maybe an intermediate area, something done in the intermediate. which is not on the bluff itself and not way out in the deeper water or near where the boats, but it makes sense to me trying to do something where the boats kind of harbor in Willard Beach.
Yeah.
Something could be done maybe, at the toe of where the bluff comes down to the sandy beach. Something could be done out there in the intertidal zone. So it wouldn't have to be as big in terms of a structure. That would be very, very complex permitting because it would be considered filling of the intertidal zone, which requires mitigation and all kinds of other things. And then it would need probably some detailed studies to show it's not going to have an adverse impact on the sediment supply at Willard Beach. Because if you do something like that, there is the chance that anything like that, a structure like that on a beach system causes what are called tombolos, which are basically concentrations of sand to form behind them. So if the structure's like this, you get a T-shaped bunch of sand that gets trapped behind there and it doesn't move. And so it sequesters sand from other areas of the beach. So it might require some detailed studies to look at that. So off the top of my head, those are the options that I would say, and I have no idea which one would be the most permissible or anything like that. And of course, I'm not a consultant, so.
Yeah. I'll just mention this. Downstream of Willard Beach and the Spring Point Shoreway is the Spring Point Lighthouse, and there is a jetty going out to that. And this same storm hit that jetty and just exploded. The waves went 75 feet in the air. And, it was a case of dissipating that energy. It went up and it didn't go in. And, had that jetty, the existing one that goes to the lighthouse, had that not been there, those waves would have headed on into Portland Harbor, but they were stopped by the jetty that's at the Spring Point Light. But thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
It was a very comprehensive, off the top of your head possible solution. So we had what's not really phrased as a question, but I'm gonna kind of pose it to you, David. So, Robin Sellen is talking about how Camp Ellis appears to be, ultimately untenable looking ahead, and this is one of the things that we've kind of talked about with sea level rise in the past, is that we have several options, and sort of the last one is to retreat. David, I wonder, I think there are probably some people who say, well, if an area is suffering repeated damage, at what point does retreat make sense? And I wonder what you'd say to that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you've been kind of fighting so hard to restore the beach at Camp Ellis.
So one of the Army Corps options is for them to buy out all the shoreline properties. I think there's a couple of problems with that. One of which everybody would have to agree to do it, and that might be difficult. I mean, I'm one of them. I would not be against it, provided that they could, give us what we think these homes are worth. It's one of the options. It's the last option, but we haven't got there yet. I think the thing that keeps it alive is that, Camp Ellis was once a very vital economic area. There were, 10 or 11 businesses down here. And now we're down to like the last couple. And the thinking, I think, is that, well, if we can fix the beach and make it all work again, then it can flourish like it once did. And that's a vision of some of our council and some other officials in Saco. So I'm not sure, I won't argue that point. I mean, I read Robert's comment, and there's nothing in there that, I would argue that doesn't make sense. But, we have the money, there's a chance to do something. And I think if we did do something, nobody knows for sure what's going to happen if they build something out there. But I think, the idea that keeps it going is that there's this thought that Camp Ellis can be reborn or revitalized and provide a lot of, economic gain to the city of Saco. So, But I don't know. I mean, I don't know where you draw the line to just give up and let it be taken away or keep fighting for it. And the attitude down here has been to fight for it.
Mhm.
May I add a quick comment?
Please.
Robert brings up a great point, but one thing to also think about is Camp Ellis did not do this to themselves. And that's a really, really important point to make. The resulting erosion of Camp Ellis is, I mean, all the beaches in Saco Bay erode to a certain point, but the erosion that's seen at Camp Ellis is explicitly exacerbated by the structure that's there, the jetty that's there. The erosion that's there would not be nearly as bad if that jetty were not there historically. You can't just remove the jetty now because the system is 150 years out of whack. But that's an important point to make because it wasn't Camp Ellis's fault. There was 600 feet of beach there in 1910. 38 house lots have been lost since 1910, not houses, but house lots have been lost since 1910. And the federal government has said it is our fault. But Robert does bring up a good point. Are buyouts more effective than doing what the Corps is proposing? And it was looked at as one of the 30 some alternatives that were modeled and considered. So I'll just leave it there. But it's an important point to make.
So let me add one thing quickly, Kate, that the Camp Ellis project is a Section 111 project in Army Corps parlance, which means that the Army Corps caused the problem, so they have to address it and fix it. And there are only 2 Section 111 projects in the entire country right now, and Camp Ellis is one of them. So, that's just to add to Peter's point, so that it is being looked at as not necessarily something that's caused by storms, rising sea levels, warming oceans. It's actually a man-made disaster.
Yeah, it is a really good point. And maybe pretty unique, like you say, David, and in Maine and in the country. It brings to mind up in Machias. I know that they are discussing a replacement of the dike there, and there is likely, with kind of, if they go with the solution that they're looking at, which is possibly a bridge, that there will be some flooding of upland properties. And I know there's discussion of a buyout there. So I mean, I guess the point being that the infrastructure that we build has very profound effects on our environment, obviously, and for now and into the future. All right, I think we it's 8:05. I'm mindful I don't want to keep you all unless there's something very pressing that I don't know, Alice, anything really pressing that you want to say before we go, or we can send everyone off into the night.
The only thing was there are a lot of I have a list. I created kind of a list of those resources, stuff like that. They're all links. So I hope that you guys can kind of somehow distribute them to the folks that were listening on tonight, because I think it's a lot of good resources there for folks to dig into this stuff a little bit more on their own time.
Thank you. Yes, we will send that out after this. It's a great list, and it has some information for people who are looking at living shorelines, right? And just some information about all of that. So that, yes, we will definitely send that out. And we can link to Allison's video as well, again, because I agree, James, it's a great video. All right. Well, thank you all again for joining us. And, hopefully we will do this again soon, although hopefully not because of another very damaging storm. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.